was just 5 years ago when private recordings revealed racist comments by then-owner Donald Sterling. And the team was eventually sold. Now, in a 30 for 30 podcast, ESPN's Ramona Shelburne details the controversy and how those private tapes became public.
I got a call by a trusted, confidential source who said, "You have to hear this."
Mike Walters was the news director at TMZ at the time. Now he runs his own celebrity news site, The Blast.
The first thing I did was say, "Who's Donald Sterling?" I had heard the name. I knew that Donald Sterling was important, but I had no idea that he owned the Clippers.
Even for someone from TMZ, whose job was breaking the internet with the juiciest, most controversial stories, this felt like something different.
I received the audio and said, "Oh my God."
Why are you broadcasting?
I'm not broadcasting
Why are you
anything.
taking pictures with minorities? Why?
What's wrong with minorities? What's wrong with black people?
Nothing. How about your whole life? Every day. You could do whatever you want. You could sleep with them, you could bring them in, you could do whatever you want. The little I ask you is not to promote it on that and not to bring them to my games.
It was the most repulsive, disgusting, unbelievable audio or moment that I'd ever heard in my lifetime come out of somebody's mouth that then once I realized who they were, how much impact that may have.
In an essay currently on The Undefeated, Natalie Diaz looks back at how that time impacted the NBA. Diaz writes, Sterling's power didn't come through winning. His power came through owning. In the case of the Clippers, what he seemed to believe was he owned were the physical bodies of the men who played for the franchise. Though what we are talking about is Sterling, we are also talking about other things. The NBA's beginnings, its past, its now, and also its future. We cannot ignore the conditions in which the NBA thrives, an extractive relationship reliant on the peak physical, intellectual, and emotional labor and performances of black men. Forcing owner Donald Sterling to sell the Clippers to another owner didn't solve the league's problems with regard to race. It's true the NBA is changing, and it's true the change is coming too slowly. We now welcome Ramona and Natalie to the show. Thank you guys for being here.
Thank you both.
Absolutely appreciate your thoughts.
Great work on both y'all parts.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I'll start with
I'm used to it with her.
Absolutely.
Yes.
We have also former athletes here, basketball at ODU, softball at Stanford.
That's right.
So we're well represented here at the table.
Yeah.
And Stephen A., just to get to the conversation, I want to start with you. What is the state of race and the NBA after Donald Sterling?
Well, first of all, it always needs to be improved upon. Let's be very, very clear about that. But I also think it's important that a dichotomy is illustrated between that of Donald Sterling and that of today's owners. I've covered the NBA for 25 years now, and I'm incredibly proud of where the league is. Does it have a ways to go? Sure. Can we see more minorities in positions of power as general managers, as president of basketball operations? I'd like to see more than Michael Jordan be an owner in the National Basketball Association. Of course. But when we take into account what Donald Sterling said, and I want to read the quote that he actually said, because I know we heard the lines from him. He said, "It bothers me a lot that you want to broadcast that you're associating with black people. You can sleep with black people. You can bring them in. You can do whatever you want. But the little I ask you is not to bring them to my games." I have not met one single owner in the National Basketball Association that resembles Donald Sterling in any way. And that was before the comment. I haven't met an owner that allowed players, that would bring not just friends, but female friends into the locker room, as you highlighted, Natalie, where he's literally bringing females into the locker room with half-naked men, black men, touching them and feeling their muscles and look at these beautiful bodies. And this is what he is saying in front of them. These are the kind of things he did in the locker room. I have never heard of, I have never seen, I've never heard of, nor have I ever seen any owner other than him in the National Basketball Association do and say the things that he has done and said. So in closing, I would like to say, I appreciate your piece. It was fantastic, by the way. I just want to make sure that we understand why we are looking at the NBA and we're saying there's progress from the Commissioner Adam Silver on down. The NBA is a far better place without Donald Sterling than it was with him. And there's only one Donald Sterling. There's only one. I'm talking about visually. Obviously, in the privacy, I don't know. I'm not fly on the wall. I have never seen another owner like Donald Sterling.
I feel like I have to ask one obvious follow-up question. Now, we have some time I want to get into with Natalie and Ramona. And Ramona, your 30 for 30 podcast is amazing because it goes into some of the deeper motivations and insecurities of Donald Sterling, which I want to talk about. But here's the obvious follow-up question. For both of you, you have covered the NBA for 25 years. Ramona, you've been intimately involved in this league for some time. Did the Donald Sterling tapes shock you? Were you blown away? Or did you know something like this could be underneath the surface with Donald Sterling?
Oh, yeah, we knew.
We knew.
We covered him in Los Angeles. ESPN, the magazine, had done a long story on it that Los Angeles Times had done multiple investigations into it. But there was something about it being on tape, about hearing it. And remember, this is 2014. This is before Ray Rice, okay? Right before, same summer, but right before. We were not in a place where we had cell phone justice, okay? We didn't have that happening yet in this world. We weren't in a place where we had an organization like TMZ that would just run a tape like that. I'm not sure if that tape was made 5 years ago, if it came to a mainstream news organization, if we would have run that. I mean, do you think so? Do you think that ESPN would have run it? CNN would have run it? LA Times? I don't know.
I kind of think ESPN would have ran it.
Found a way to get that in there?
I'm going to speak up for ESPN on that.
I don't know.
I think we would have found a way to have that on tape once it was verified that it was him, the worldwide leader, this place. I think they would. We would have found a way to.
Something I wonder about is also the sensationalism of it. And so, yes, it was on tape, which of course let us have this verification. Like we've been saying, like, oh, now we can verify it. Now we can push it forward. And of course, there are legalities that you have to consider, but. What about Elgin Baylor? Like, you know, at what point do we verify these things? And it tends to be in professional sports in general, we verify them when they have some sort of sensational aspect to them. So it becomes the spectacle. And I think that is something that I feel is a little bit problematic about, you know, when we address these, when we make these leaps and change, that some of the regular day-to-day was ignored. Yet when it became sensational or spectacular, then we were forced to move.
I would say to you, there's not a place or a circumstance in America where you can't point to that being a reality. Usually the sensational highlights a particular situation. It forces you to lock in on that particular situation and address some of the crumbs or some of the remnants of what actually exists around it. Then it fades from the spotlight. And not that you get back to normal, but you're safe enough to get back to a place where some of these things are still existing, but it's not as prevalent as it once was before it was highlighted.
And I personally, you know, I'm just glad we got here. Yeah. I'm glad the conversation started, and I'm glad the conversation became public somehow. Even though it started from, like, as we found out in your 30 for 30 podcast, it really started from a lover spat that turned into something, a national conversation around race relations, and the NBA was thrust into the front. And Natalie, in your piece for The Undefeated, you said, language matters, words matters. And we saw the word owner become examined as well. And we saw players like Draymond Green speak up about the word owner. What is your feeling around the table? Start with you, Natalie, on the term owner.
Yeah, I mean, again, you know, I think all of our work here is about language in a way, you know, and I think, you know, I'm coming from a perspective of poetry where I do have this luxury of compression of language. And so just pulling a word apart. But at the same time, I think a lot of you are poets in a way of, you know, talking about athletics, talking about how this relates to our culture and what this reflects. I think in terms of the word owner, you know, and I don't think anyone can address it any more clearly than Draymond Green. Like, yes, we used this word 100 years ago. It doesn't make it right today. And what I'm worried about, I think the thing I'm questioning is you have the owner. Now, what does that mean about who that word is applied to, or who's beneath that word or above that word?
Allow me to chime in because I'm really interested in all of your opinions about where I stand on this. I got a really good relationship with Draymond Green. I got a lot of love for him and respect for him. I respectfully disagreed with him on this particular issue. Here's why. I own my house. I don't own anybody that's in my house. But when you come into my house, there are rules and regulations that you're going to follow because I'm responsible for the overhead. I'm responsible for the bills. I'm responsible for this franchise. If Joe Lacob is the owner for the Golden State Warriors, the problem is Donald Sterling acted like he owned the players. That you don't have any evidence that Joe Lacob is that way. You don't have any evidence that Mark Cuban is that way. That Peter Holt in San Antonio is that way. Steve Ballmer is that way. Donald Sterling's transgressions as a human being doesn't necessarily get attached to everybody. And so when I look at it from the perspective of Draymond or anybody else's issue with the word ownership, I'm saying, wait a minute. Those lights that are on in the Oracle Arena, Joe Lacob and those boys got to pay for that. The salaries. And for the people around you, the equipment manager, the equipment that's in the building, et cetera, you got to pay for that. There's nothing wrong with me saying I'm the owner of this franchise and I have responsibility and dominion over it. You can separate that from saying you own the player. And I can understand the sensitivity to the word owner, but I think that it's wrong to automatically say the word should be eradicated just because somebody's going to find it offensive, when I don't believe it's based in fact in terms of collaterally. It doesn't apply to everybody is my point.
And I would say very few people think they own other human beings. Obviously, Donald Sterling and his behavior being an exception to that. Changing the term from owner to governor, I'm very doubtful would have changed Donald Sterling's heart. I'm very doubtful it would have changed Donald Sterling's behavior. Owner is an aspirational term. Steven Jackson came on my show, The Will Cain Show, and he talked with you on The Jump, and he said, I aspire to be an owner. We're proud that Michael Jordan is an owner. But nobody assumes that means he owns any people. He owns a company.
So Donald Sterling was a real estate baron, okay? He's the largest residential landlord in Los Angeles County. Like every apartment building, when you drive down Wilshire Boulevard, probably the Sterling Corporation owns it. And he thought of his team the same way he thinks of real estate, as property.
Right.
And everybody who works for his team and everybody who plays for his team were his property. Most people understand that you can't own human beings.
Right.
But I think language matters. He didn't get that. And I agree with you, Will. I don't think changing the term owner to governor would have affected his heart, because I think he saw everything as property, as something he owned, as something he controlled, as people who should be grateful to him for giving them a job. Okay? He never saw that these players, they didn't need him to give them a job. They can go work and play anywhere. But it wouldn't have changed his heart. But I do think language matters, and I think it's a worthwhile discussion, because all of us here